The frost came early to Harrow Flats that October, and Josephine Vane arrived on the same train as the cold. She had $40, a carpetbag held together with borrowed twine, and a letter from a man she'd never met that said, in handwriting so cramped it looked like small animal tracks, "I need someone capable. The work is hard. The winters are harder. If you can manage both, write back." She had written back. She hadn't had much else to do after the fire took the bakery and her mother along with it. The station at Harrow Flats was 2 boards nailed to a post. The town itself wasn't much more than that. A general store, a livery, a church that leaned slightly west as if it had given up on standing straight, and a hotel that smelled of pipe smoke and regret. Josephine stood on the platform with her bag at her feet and watched the train pull away, taking with it the last reasonable exit she had. A man was waiting beside a wagon. She knew it was Calloway before he said anything. The letter had said he was a rancher, and he had the look of one, worn through in places, like leather left too long in the sun. He was taller than she'd pictured, with a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days and eyes the color of creek water in November. He looked at her the way a man looks at a fence post he's not sure will hold. "Miss Vane," he said. "Mr. Calloway." He picked up her bag without asking and put it in the wagon. She climbed up herself. Neither of them spoke for the first mile. His name was Edmund Calloway, though the town called him Calloway like that was sufficient, and most days it was. He had a daughter 8 years old, named Brinley, who stared at Josephine from across the supper table that first night, with eyes so solemn they made Josephine feel she was being evaluated by someone much older than 8. He had a ranch that had been going sideways for 2 years, ever since his wife passed and took most of the forward momentum with her. He did not say any of this in so many words. Josephine pieced it together from the state of the account ledgers she found in the kitchen drawer, the patches on Brinley's dress, and the way Edmund ate supper standing at the counter instead of sitting at the table. The arrangement was simple. Josephine would keep the house, manage the accounts, help with Brinley. In return, she had room, board, and a wage that was modest but honest. There had been no discussion of anything more than that, and Josephine had not expected any. She was practical by nature and desperate by circumstance, and she understood that those two conditions together made a person easy to take advantage of. She was watching for it. What she had not been watching for was Edmund's brother. Jasper Calloway arrived 3 weeks after Josephine, on a Tuesday, which she would later think about as the day the weather changed, without any of the usual warning signs. He rode in from the south looking expensive. Good horse, good coat, the kind of easy confidence that came from never having had to apologize for anything. He was younger than Edmund by a few years and looked it in the face, though something in his eyes was older and less forgiving. "So you're the arrangement," Jasper said, looking at Josephine the way she'd been looked at by men before who thought looking was the same as owning. "I'm the housekeeper," she said. He smiled. It didn't reach those eyes. Funny thing about Edmund's arrangements. They have a way of not lasting. Edmund was in the barn when Jasper arrived, and by the time he came in for supper, the two brothers were already in the particular kind of silence that meant they had already said the things they didn't want witnessed. Brinley ate quickly and asked to be excused. Josephine stayed at the stove and kept her back to the room and listened. "The bank won't wait past spring," Jasper said. "I know that. You need capital you don't have." "I know that too. I have it." A pause. The sound of a chair being pulled out. "There's a way to solve this, Edmund." "You know there is. Go to bed, Jasper." That night, lying in the narrow room off the kitchen that was hers, Josephine stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind come through the gap under the door and thought about the tone of Jasper's voice. She had heard that tone before. It was the tone of a man who had already decided something and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. She found out what he had decided 10 days later. Edmund had gone to town for feed and hadn't come back by supper, which wasn't unusual. Brinley was asleep. Jasper found Josephine in the kitchen going over the accounts by lamplight, a thing she had taken to doing because the numbers told a story Edmund wouldn't, and she needed to understand what she'd walked into. Jasper sat down across from her without being invited. "You're good with figures," he said, looking at the ledger. "I've had to be. Edmund doesn't deserve you," he said it conversationally, like a man noting the weather. "He barely notices you're here." Josephine closed the ledger. "What do you want, Mr. Calloway?" He leaned back and crossed his arms and looked at her with that measuring look she had learned to distrust. "There's a problem with this ranch," he said. "The debt's real, the bank's real, and Edmund's plan to outlast it is not a plan. It's stubbornness. That seems like your brother's concern. It's the family's concern. And the family's solution," he said, "involves this ranch staying in Calloway hands. That means Edmund either sells to me at a price I set or he signs over operational control. Either way, the land doesn't leave the family." Josephine waited. Jasper smiled again. The same smile as before. And you, he said, are a complication. A woman living on Callaway property with no particular claim to it, which makes your future rather dependent on whoever controls the ranch. She understood then, the full shape of it, the way you understand something unpleasant that you've been sensing at the edges for a while. You're telling me my position here isn't secure, she said. I'm telling you it could be made very secure. He placed a folded document on the table between them. My lawyer drew this up. Edmund's signature's already on it. He signed it last year when the debt first got bad, gave me the right to take operational control if certain conditions were met. Those conditions have been met. As of last month, I own this ranch. Josephine looked at the document, didn't touch it. Edmund doesn't know, Jasper continued. He will soon. But the transition can be smooth or it can be difficult, and that depends largely on you. Stay on as housekeeper, same wages, same room. Brinley gets to stay too, nothing changes except who holds the deed. He paused. Or I can make it complicated for everyone. She kept her voice flat. What does complicated look like? It looks like a woman with no references and no family being escorted off a private ranch in the middle of a Canadian winter with her carpet bag and $40. His voice stayed pleasant. I don't want that. It would be bad for Brinley. Edmund would blame himself. But I need you to understand how things stand. She understood exactly how things stood. She also understood that she had no proof of anything, no allies and nowhere to go. I'll need to see the original document, she said, buying time the way her mother had taught her, with questions that sounded like cooperation. Jasper left the document on the table when he went to bed. Josephine sat with it in the lamplight for a long time. Then she made herself tea, which she didn't drink, and thought about a woman she'd known in Montreal who'd taught her that the most important thing about being in trouble was not to look like you were in trouble. She had learned that lesson young. She was going to need it now. She told Edmund in the morning. She had considered not telling him, considered waiting, observing, learning more before she moved. But Edmund came in from the early chores with frost on his collar and the particular look of a man who had slept badly. And when he poured his coffee and stood at the counter he looked, she thought, like someone who was already braced for the next blow and could not quite straighten under the weight of the ones before. She set the document in front of him. He read it. She watched his face. He read it again. He said, I signed this, Edmund said. Your name is on it. He turned the page over like there might be something different on the back. I signed papers 2 years ago when we restructured the debt. He told me it was loan collateral. It wasn't. Edmund set the document down very carefully on the counter. Josephine had expected anger. What she saw instead was something quieter and worse. The look of a man who understood that he had been managed by someone who knew him well enough to know which lies he would believe. Jasper and I? He stopped. We grew up on this land. Our father built it? I know. He wouldn't. He stopped again. Josephine didn't fill the silence. Some truths had to be arrived at without assistance. Edmund stood at the counter for a long time. Then he said, What does he want? Control the deed. Probably your cooperation to keep the transition quiet. And you? He told me my position would be made secure if I cooperated. She paused. I'm not sure I trust his definition of secure. Edmund looked at her then. Really looked at her, which he hadn't done much since she arrived too caught in his own weather to notice anyone else's. He put you in the middle of this deliberately. Yes, because he thought. Edmund's jaw tightened. Because he thought? You'd have no reason to tell me. I expect so. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but the beginning of something. The recognition, maybe, that she was standing on his side of the line without having been asked. What do we do? He said. It was the first time he had said we about anything. What they did first was go through every document Edmund had ever signed. Josephine ran the accounts. She had a mind for numbers the way some people had a mind for music. Not because she'd been taught, but because patterns felt natural to her, readable. She went through 2 years of records at the kitchen table, while Brinley did her schoolwork beside her, and asked occasional questions that Josephine answered honestly, in the simplified but accurate way she thought children deserved. On the third feature night she found something. The loan document Jasper had produced listed a repayment default date of September of last year. But the ranch's own records, the actual deposit slips, the bank correspondence Edmund had kept in a tin box under his bed at Josephine's request, showed a payment made in August. A week early, a payment the document claimed had never arrived. This payment, she said, laying the slip beside the document. Did you make it yourself? Mailed it? Edmund said. Josephine, that's... The bank would have records. He stared at her. The document claims default, she said carefully. But if the bank received payment, there was no default, which means the conditions for the clause were never triggered, which means the clause itself never activated. Edmund sat back. So the transfer isn't legal. Or at least, it's contestable. She kept her voice measured. You'd need a lawyer, possibly a judge. And you'd need Jasper not to realize what you'd found until you'd had time to act on it. They sat with that for a moment, the lamp between them. Outside, the November wind doing what November wind in the territory did, which was remind you that it didn't care about your problems. He'll figure it out, Edmund said. Jasper's not slow. No, but he thinks I'm cooperating. She folded the payment slip carefully. I was very agreeable this morning. Edmund looked at her for a long moment. You were buying time. I've done it before. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face. It changed him. Made him look, she thought, more like himself. Where are you from, Miss Vane? Montreal originally. More recently, wherever the work was. She tucked the slip into the account book. My mother taught me that the most dangerous thing a woman can be is someone that men don't bother to watch. He was quiet. Then, Josephine. It was the first time he'd used her given name. Edmund, she replied. The lawyer was in Dunmore, 2 hours east. Edmund went on a Wednesday, telling Jasper he needed parts for the tractor that had been misfiring since September. Jasper watched him leave with the particular stillness of a man who stored observations for later use. And Josephine made Jasper coffee and asked him about land prices in the South, which he was pleased to talk about at length. She kept the account books out, made herself look busy with nothing important. When Brinley came in from school and looked at Josephine with those solemn 8-year-old eyes, Josephine gave the smallest shake of her head, and Brinley sat down without asking questions, which was, Josephine thought, more self-possession than most adults managed. Edmund came back that evening. Josephine saw his face before he was fully through the door and felt something in her chest settle. The bank has the record, he said quietly. Once Jasper had gone to bed. The payment posted. Their ledger shows it. The lawyer says the clause never triggered. Can he move quickly? He's filing papers in the morning. Judge in Dunmore owes him a favor that he's calling in for the emergency hearing. Edmund sat down at the table, looking wrung out in the way of someone who has done a necessary difficult thing. Jasper is going to know, probably by end of week. Yes, and he is not going to take it well. No. They sat in the kitchen with the stove ticking as it cooled and the dark pressing in at the windows. Brinley was asleep. The ranch was quiet the way it only got after 10 at night, when the animals had settled and there was nothing left between you and whatever you were thinking about. You didn't have to do this, Edmund said. You could have stayed quiet, kept your position either way. I thought about it, she said honestly. He nodded like that was the answer he'd expected. But your daughter's here, Josephine said. And whatever Jasper says about nothing changing, things always change when a man like that takes control. I've seen it. She looked at her hands on the table. I didn't want Brinley to have to learn it the same way I did. Edmund was quiet for a long moment. What happened to you? He said. It wasn't quite a question. My mother ran a bakery in Montreal. Good business, honest one. When she died, her brother appeared and said the building was his because the lease had always been in his name. She kept her voice level. Turned out he'd had her sign something years before, when she needed money for the ovens. She thought it was a loan. It was a lien. And you lost everything. I lost everything, she agreed. So when Jasper put that document on the table, I recognized the shape of it, the way it comes with a smile, the way it's presented as already decided. Edmund reached across the table and put his hand over hers for a moment, brief and deliberate. I'm sorry, he said. About your mother. It was such a plain, careful thing to say that she felt her eyes sting, which she hadn't expected. Thank you, she said. Jasper found out on a Friday. He came in from town with the particular quality of stillness that preceded a storm, and he stood in the doorway of the kitchen where Josephine was putting up preserved carrots, and he looked at her with those eyes that had never really been warm and said very quietly, You told him. Yes, she said. That was a mistake. I've made worse. She kept her back to him, hands moving steadily. She had learned that fear was most useful before the thing happened. Once it was happening, what you needed was steadiness. You have nothing here, Jasper said. You understand that. You're a woman from nowhere, with a carpet bag and a job that exists because my brother was too proud to admit he needed to hire a housekeeper from a matrimonial register. You have no claim. The judge has reviewed the bank records, Josephine said. The hearing was yesterday. Edmund's lawyer moved quickly. She turned around and faced him, because some things needed to be looked at directly. The deed is Edmund's. The transfer was never legal. And Jasper. The lawyer also found 3 other documents your brother signed that have similar problems. They've been submitted to the court. The color left Jasper's face. You should speak with your own lawyer, Josephine said. I think that would be advisable. He left that night, not loudly, that wasn't his way, but permanently, taking his horse and his good coat and his easy confidence. and the particular shape he'd put on the air in every room he'd stood in. Josephine, his lantern moved down the track from the kitchen window and felt the house exhale. Edmund was in the doorway behind her. "He's gone," she said. "I heard the horse. He came to stand beside her at the window. You knew he'd leave." "I thought he might. Men like that prefer not to be present for the consequences." She lowered the curtain. "He'll find lawyers of his own. This isn't over." "No, but we have ground to fight from now." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, Brinley asked me this morning if you were staying." Josephine looked at him. "I told her that was your decision to make," Edmund said. "She told me I should ask you properly, because apparently I have a habit of assuming people know what I mean without being told." "She's right," Josephine said. "You do." His mouth did the thing it had done when she'd mentioned being agreeable. "Will you stay?" She considered the question as she'd considered most things in her life, not quickly, because she'd learned that quick decisions in tight circumstances were often just fear wearing the costume of certainty. She looked around the kitchen, which she had quietly reorganized over the past weeks. She thought about the account book she was beginning to understand. She thought about Brinley's solemn eyes and the way they'd gone slightly less solemn recently, which felt like something worth protecting. She thought about a man who had said, "I'm sorry about your mother," like he meant it. "What would staying look like?" she said, practically speaking. Edmund looked at the floor, then back at her. "Honestly, I hadn't gotten that far. I've been working on the immediate problem. Then we'll work on it together," she said, practically speaking. He nodded once in the careful way he had. "All right?" Outside, the wind had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that came after a long difficulty. Not peace exactly, just the absence of the immediate trouble, which was, Josephine knew, different. There was still the legal matter. Still the debt, the land, the slow rebuilding of things that had been allowed to slide. Still Jasper somewhere licking wounds and deciding what came next. But the kitchen was warm. Brinley would be down for breakfast in the morning. The account books were open on the table, and for the first time in 2 years the numbers in them pointed somewhere other than down. Jasper's lawyer sent papers in January. The claim was reduced. Fraud, his lawyer argued, or at least misrepresentation on the bank's end. It was a long reach, and everyone who knew the law knew it, but long reaches sometimes connected, and they couldn't afford to ignore it. The months that followed had a particular texture that Josephine would remember later as the feeling of standing in a stream. You kept your footing, but the current was always there. She took over the accounts completely by February. Edmund didn't ask her to. She simply expanded into the space left by the things he was less equipped for, and he expanded into the spaces left by the things she was less equipped for, and somewhere in the arrangement they'd made something that was, if not exactly balanced, then at least stable in the way a structure is stable, when different things are holding different parts of it up. Brinley decided in March that Josephine should teach her to bake bread. This turned out to be a production. Brinley had strong opinions about things for an 8-year-old, and strong hands for her size, and the first 3 loaves came out either flat or dense or possessed by some architectural ambition that made them impossible to cut. The 4th was good. Josephine said so, and Brinley looked at the loaf with the seriousness of a woman who had done a necessary difficult thing. "Pa can't bake at all," Brinley said. "No," Josephine agreed. "He burns everything." "He does. Are you going to marry him?" Josephine set down the bread knife. "What makes you ask that?" Brinley considered. "Elsa Prentice at school says her mother says you're going to have to because of the arrangement." "Elsa Prentice's mother is guessing," Josephine said carefully. "Grown-ups guess a lot and say it like it's settled." "But are you?" "I don't know," Josephine said. Which was the honest answer. Brinley seemed to consider this satisfactory. She cut herself a piece of bread, ate it, and announced that it needed more salt next time. The legal matter resolved in April. The judge in Dunmore found for Edmund. Jasper's claim had no ground to stand on once the bank records were properly entered, and whatever else Jasper was, he wasn't, in the end, willing to spend the money required to pursue it further. He sent a letter after the ruling, not to Edmund but to Josephine, which she thought was revealing. It said, in the cramped, expensive handwriting of a man who was careful with words, "You've made an enemy, nothing else." She put the letter in the stove. Edmund found her in the kitchen afterward with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup and the stove just lit, staring at the middle distance the way you did after a thing was finally over and your body hadn't yet received the news. "What did it say?" he asked. "That I've made an enemy." Edmund sat down across from her. He'd been doing that more often lately, sitting at the table instead of standing at the counter. Josephine noticed these things the way she noticed the account books, not because she was watching for them, but because they were patterns, and patterns were what her mind did. "He'd have found a way to make one of you anyway," Edmund said. "That's what Jasper does. He decides what's his, and then he decides what's in the way." I know. She looked up from the cup. I was always going to be in the way. The question was just whether I knew it in time. Edmund looked at her for a long moment. He had a way of being quiet that wasn't absence. It was more like attention. She'd learned to read it. Josephine, he said. Edmund, Brinley tells me you've been teaching her to bake bread. She tells me you burn everything. That's accurate. Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile yet, but close. I've been thinking about what you said. About staying. About doing it practically. You've been thinking about it since February, she said. I could tell. He blinked. Could you? You start speaking less when you're working something out? You're already not very talkative, so it becomes noticeable. He looked at the table, then back at her. My wife, he said slowly, like he was checking each word before he set it down, was someone I had known all my life. We made sense before we had to think about making sense. I don't know how to, he stopped. I'm not asking you to already know, Josephine said. What are you asking? She thought about it. About $40 in borrowed twine. About a letter that said, I need someone capable, and what it felt like to answer it and mean it. Not because she'd had nowhere else to go, but because something in the plainness of it had sounded, to her, like honesty. She thought about a man who'd said we and meant it without realizing he'd changed anything. I'm asking you to keep doing what we've been doing, she said, which is figuring it out as we go, with honesty. And some notice when you're working something out, instead of leaving me to deduce it from word count. He did smile then, a real one, brief and crooked and entirely genuine. That's fair, he said. It is, she agreed. Outside, the April mud had begun its annual war with the boots of anyone foolish enough to cross the yard, and the fields were showing the first tentative green of a season that had no idea what had happened over the winter, and was going to go ahead and grow anyway, which Josephine thought was, on reflection, exactly the right approach. Spring's late, Edmund said, looking out the window. It always is, up here. Ranch'll need everything this season. It'll be hard. I know, she said. He looked at her. You're not worried. I'm always worried, Josephine said. I just don't find that it helps to show it. He nodded, reached across the table in the way he'd begun to. Not dramatically, just as a fact, as if they'd negotiated the gesture at some point without either of them noticing the negotiation, and his hand settled over hers on the table. Thank you, he said, for everything he didn't know how to list. You're welcome, she said, for everything she didn't need listed. They sat in the kitchen while the April light moved across the table, and the stove warmed the room, and somewhere upstairs Brinley moved around getting ready for school, stomping one-footed the way she always did when she was putting on her left boot, a sound so ordinary and so particular that Josephine had begun to think of it as one of the sounds a place made when it was becoming home. She didn't know yet exactly what the future looked like. The ranch was steadier but not secure. There were still debts, still hard seasons ahead, still Jasper somewhere making his plans. There was still the question of what exactly they were building and what to call it when they got there. But she had $40 once in borrowed twine and a letter from a stranger in cramped handwriting that said, I need someone capable. She had answered it. She had shown up. The rest, she had always known, was the work of staying.